Alright, so we are going to multiply polynomials today. So, remember that a monomial is just one term, such as 3x, and a binomial is two monomials that are added or subtracted. So 5x plus 2 would be an example of a binomial. So bi means two, so a binomial. And these are both examples of polynomials. So today we're going to focus on multiplying a monomial times a binomial, as well as a binomial times a binomial. So our first example is going to be multiplying a monomial times a binomial. So that's not too difficult. You've got the monomial out front, and you need to multiply that by each term. So in other words, you're just distributing. So you multiply by the first one, so that would be the 5x times the 3x. And then you multiply it by the second term, so the 2 times the 3x. And so then your final answer, when I multiply these, I have 15. And since I have x times x, that's x squared. And then I have 2 times 3x, so that gives me 6x. All right, moving on. So we have two more examples here. So again, what I'm really doing here is distributing. So I just distribute this to both terms. Okay, so I have the 3x times 5x squared plus the 7 times the 5x squared. Then I just go ahead and multiply. So this would give me 15x, and since I have x times x squared, x cubed, and then 7 times 5, 35x squared. Alright, and again in standard form I have to the third and to the second, so that works for standard form. Okay, on this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to distribute to both terms. So I have the 4x first. So I multiply the 4x times the negative 2x, and then I'm going to subtract 8 times the negative 2x. Okay, so now when I go to multiply this, I have a positive times a negative, so that's a negative 8, and x times x gives me an x squared. And then here I'm going to multiply, I have 8 times negative 2x. So that's going to actually give me a negative 16x. And therefore I'm going to change that to a plus sign because I'm subtracting a negative. So negative 8x squared plus 16x. If you want, you can also think about that as a negative x, a negative 8 times a negative 2x. So if we took a negative 8 times a negative 2x, I would automatically make that a positive 16x, okay, without having to go through this step of subtracting a negative. Okay, so now let's talk about multiplying a binomial times a binomial. So there's two different methods. The first method is making a table. So if you make a table to keep track of all your terms, you can write these two terms at the side of your table here, and then these two terms at the top of your table. Okay, and then all you're going to do is multiply and fill in the table. So in order for this first one, I'm going to multiply these two together. So negative 10 and negative 5 makes a positive 50, and then x times x makes x squared. Then for this second box, I'm going to do a negative 5 times a negative 5 gives me 25x. Okay, in this box, I'm going to do negative 10x times 6. So a negative 10 times 6 is negative 60. And then add the variable. Lastly here, negative 5 times 6, that gives me a negative 30. Okay, so I'm going to combine like terms, so I'm going to look and see if any of them can be combined. I see that these two can. So now I'm going to write my answer in standard form, so it's going to be 50x squared. If I combine these two, I have a negative 60 and a positive 25, so that gives me positive 35. And then I can just write the negative 30, and that's my final answer. Alright, so let's try one more using this method. So again, I'm going to write these terms over at the side. And I'm going to write these terms of the second polynomial up at the top. So this might be a good place to pause and then see if you know how to do this correctly, okay? So I'm just going to go through this. After you've paused, go ahead and watch and make sure you have this correct. Okay, so again, as you're multiplying, you multiply the coefficients, so negative 32, and you have x to the squared and x to the third, so that makes x to the fifth. Okay, so you go through and do that for each one. Remember, if you have a negative times a negative, it gives you a positive answer. So then you're going to go back and combine like terms. So I see to the fifth, to the fourth, to the third, and squared, so I can't combine those. So I write it in standard form. Okay, so some of you might need to see a second example, so I'm going to go ahead and do one more example, which is actually our third example if you count the one when I was explaining it. So I'm going to go ahead and go through one more example here. Feel free to fast forward if you already understand this. So I'm going to write these here. Then I'm going to multiply the terms to fill in each box. Then I look to see if anything can be combined. I see the third, the second, the first power, and nothing. So since nothing can be combined, I'll just write my answer in standard form. And that is my answer. Okay, so again, make sure you combine like terms and make sure you write your answer in standard form. Alright, so let's move on to the other method. The other method is foiling. So this might look kind of confusing, but maybe you've heard the word FOIL before, I'm not sure. So FOIL stands for first, outside, inside, last. So this is just another method. So you have these two binomials, and I color-coded this to try to help you out. So first you're going to multiply the first two terms. So the first two terms would be negative 3x and negative 2x. So I multiplied the first two terms, and I got 6x squared. Next I'm going to multiply the outside terms. So that's the two on the outside. So make sure you take the sign in front of them with them. So that would be negative 3x and negative 4, which gives me 12x. Next I take the inside, so that's going to be these two in green, so 2 and negative 2x. You can see I multiplied those, and I get negative 4x. And then lastly, I take the last two terms, which is 2 and negative 4. I multiply those, and I get negative 8. Okay, so instead of a table, I just have this list of terms. And then I can go ahead and combine them together. So I have, these are like terms, so I can combine those together and I'd get 8x. So then I put it in standard form, 6x squared plus 8x minus 8. And remember, always combine like terms and then put it into standard form. So I'm going to do two more examples for you of FOIL. Okay, so here's the first one. So my first two terms are going to be negative 5x squared times 3x squared. I'm sorry, negative 5x cubed times 3x squared. So that would be negative 15x to the fifth. Then I have my outside, which would be these two. So that's going to be a 50x cubed, because it's negative 5x cubed times negative 10. Then I'm going to have inside, which are these two. So I have x squared times 3x squared, which will be 3x to the fourth. And then finally, I have the last term. So x squared times negative 10 would give me negative 10x squared. Okay, so if this method is confusing to you, feel free to use the table method. Or if you like this one better, you can use this one also. So I look to see if any of them can be combined. I have to the fifth, to the third, to the fourth, and second. Nothing can be combined, so now I just write it in standard form. Okay, again, so you just go ahead and look at the exponents. If it's 50, that means it's plus 50. If it's negative 10x, it becomes negative 10x. All right, last example. So I'm going to multiply first my first terms. So that's 3 times 4 That's 12, and x times x, x squared. My outside terms is a 3x times a negative 8x, so that gives me negative 24x. Okay, next is my inside terms, that's these two. So negative 4 times 4x, negative 16x. And then finally last, I have a negative 4 times a negative 8, gives me a positive 32. Okay, so now I go through and I combine any like terms I have, which these can be combined. So I'm going to write it in standard form, 12x squared. If I combine those together, that would give me 40, so minus 40x plus 32. Okay, so that's how I use the FOIL method. So whether you want to make a table or use the FOIL method, either of those methods will work for multiplying a binomial times a binomial.